In our last video, we discussed transitional forms. If evolution is true, and if things actually came about in a materialistic way without a creator or a designer, then what you should find in the fossil record is that you should find a series of fossils and things that would be what we call transitional forms. Evolution says that you have small changes, many of them over lots of time, and those develop eventually into big changes because natural selection picks for the fittest animal. And so if an animal gets a mutation and that mutation helps it survive in an environment, then that particular mutation is helpful. And so basically that critter survives better, and then the better they survive, then the better they're able to pass on those things to their offspring. But they're small changes, little changes, small, maybe one or two changes in a DNA code. And then what happens is over a period of many, many, many millions of years, sometimes what'll happen is that you supposedly go from one kind of organism to a completely different kind. So like going from a fish to a reptile, or from a reptile to a bird, or from a monkey to a man. But this occurs in small steps over a long time. So you have to have these in-between forms that supposedly can still survive, even though they're in between forms. And you should be able to find a lot of those in the fossil record. In fact, if evolution is true, there should be lots and lots of indisputable transitional forms. Now, today, what I want to do is talk about just a couple different things. The first one I want to talk about is this thing called a chrysoptegyrian. Now, chrysoptegyrian for years was considered a supposed transitional form between a fish and an early amphibian. And so the chrysoptegyrian was a lobe-finned fish. And supposedly what we had developed, according to evolutionists, is that these fins in the bones in these fins eventually changed a little bit and got to the point over a period of many, many thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, they got to a point where these fish could actually walk out of water, and it would they kind of the legs could support weight, and so they could literally walk. Now, this would be an advantage to a fish, especially a freshwater fish. If a pond dried up, they could just get out and walk to a new pond and live. And we know that there are some fish that can do that today. They ponds can dry up and they can go to new ones. But this one was, supposedly we found some that were like 50 or 60 million years old. And so, and then we hadn't seen them for a long time. So what they did was they saw these bones and they said, well, maybe, the chrysoptegyrian looks something like this, that you had reptiles or fish, and then you got these chrysoptegyrians, and they lived in these, shallow waters, and eventually they could come out and walk on land, more maybe waddle than walk, but they could actually start to get out on land and walk, and then eventually over a period of many, many, many more years, these things could develop into a point where they develop more into legs. And of course, that would be a great survival value because they were really legs. And they probably had to develop lungs as well. And so they would have been in transitional form. So this was supposedly the chrysoptegyrian right here. This is what they thought. They thought he lived in shallow waters and stuff. But this fossil was really old, millions and millions of years old. Okay, I think it's 500 million years old. And so everybody thought that it, lived in shallow waters. Well, then they found one. They found a live one. Okay. And they call it, it's called a coelacanth. Okay. And they sometimes call this a living fossil because what had happened is this fossil wasn't in the fossil record at all for like 500 million years. And then all of a sudden we find a live one. Okay. But what's interesting is the live one we found is just like the fossils, if you found it fossilized, it would be just like that old Chrysopterygian that they talked about. But guess what? It wasn't living in shallow seas where it could walk in and out of the water. It actually lived in very deep water. Not only deep water, but so deep that like when they pulled it up, when they first caught one of these, literally they got in a net, and as they were pulling it up, because of the difference in pressure, it literally kind of blew up inside and died. The reason why is because this lived in deep oceans. It didn't live anywhere in a shallow sea. But isn't it interesting that when we looked at the fossil, we determined that it was, must be an evolutionary in-between form, a transitional form. And if it was in a transitional form, then probably it lived in shallow seas. So here's an example of what we call a living fossil. It was a fossil that had not changed in 500 million years. And if the fossil bones didn't really change much, then basically the probably lifestyle didn't either. And so maybe that fossil that we used to think, Chrysopterygian, we used to think was living in the shallow seas. Many people now, even strong evolutionists, say, well, we missed that one. It really wasn't. We have these living fossils. We have this thing called stasis, where we end up having fossils and they stay the same. They don't change into these transitional forms over in small changes over millions of years, like the evolutionary model predicts. One other one we want to talk about today is what we call the Cambrian explosion. Sometimes Time had a magazine article called Evolution's Big Bang. And basically, the idea here is that we look at the fossil record and we find that there was this explosion of different forms of life. Now, remember, we've talked about phylogenetic trees before. Basically, evolutionists say that as time moves on, the morphology of different animals changes, and you get these kind of like trees. And so, like, you would have maybe a fish down here, and then an amphibian here, and then a reptile, and then, birds and man. And so the idea here is that you have these phylogenetic tree-like shapes that you should find in the fossil record. And the idea is diversity actually precedes disparity. But what you find when you really look at the fossil record is this. You find in Precambrian rocks. Now, Precambrian rocks are some of the oldest rocks there are, okay? They're like almost the basement rocks, and the lowest rocks, you assume, especially if they're sedimentary rocks, they were probably laid down before the rocks above them. And so what you have here is evolutionists say, we found some really simple organisms in Precambrian rocks. I mean, really simple, like just one or two celled critters, maybe just a few cells. And then what happens is you get this next layer of rocks, and you have all kinds of different forms of animals. Now, Darwin's theory says that basically, as these developed here, you should have things that branch off into different types and body forms. And we ought to see transitional forms of those body forms as we go to there. But you don't. You have this huge gap where there's nothing transitional. And then all of a sudden you have all these different body forms all at once. The early Cambrian rocks, those are the lowest sedimentary rock layers, and a lot of creationists think these were formed because of the flood. And before those rocks, the Precambrian rocks, they're like really, really ancient rocks. These would be, bedrock from, some of the oldest rocks on the planet. Well, you have just really simple organisms here and here, in the like the metazoan critters and stuff, like little 1 and 2 cell organisms. And then when you get to the Cambrian rocks, you get all these different body forms. Look at all the different forms. Many of these we recognize, and we evolutionists say that all of these forms happen by chance over millions of years. But what happens is we don't have any of those transitional forms in these early in these early rocks. It's kind of like this. You have early Precambrian rocks, and you have just some prokaryotes, some really simple critters. Then you have eukaryotes, which are a little bit more complex cells. And then you have these metazoans, okay? And you get all these different forms. Now, if evolution is true, there ought to be all kinds of phylogenetic trees. There are all kinds of in-between forms showing, like, how did we get a chordator? How did we get a starfish? What were the transitions between them? And what we find is that there was this Cambrian explosion of body forms and body parts here, but there's nothing leading up to them. It's basically you have a few simple cells, and then boom, you have all this complex life. And that's a major gap in transitional forms. And this doesn't support the evolutionary idea. This supports the design idea, the creation idea. So there's major conclusions, or major gaps in the fossil record. That's one of the things we can conclude by all of these missing transitional forms. And that's exactly what the creation model predicts. Now, Charles Darwin actually admitted this when he was writing, his Origin of Species, and while he was developing that, it says, he said, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum just full of these intermediate types, these intermediate links, the transitional forms? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. So he recognized that this theory that he was coming up with, natural selection and evolution, he basically said that this was the most serious objection, was these missing transitional forms. But notice what he says. He says the explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geologic record. In other words, basically what he was saying was, hey, we've only been studying this for a little while. And, the longer we study this, the more of these transitional forms we'll find. That we just haven't seen or found all of the transitional forms because we haven't found all the fossils. Well, that was, quite a few years ago. That was in 1859. Well, now here we are in 2023, and this is still a problem. We still don't have those. In fact, if anything, the gaps are more obvious and that we don't have transitional forms. And so it's a real problem for evolutionists and natural people who believe only in naturalistic ways that our life could have evolved on our planet. Now, there are some scientists today, even who are evolutionists, that actually at least agree with this and know and have really at least been honest about this missing transitional form. One of them was Stephen Gould. Now, he just passed away 3 years ago, but he was one of the foremost evolutionary biologists. But just, here, this is what he wrote. The absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates in many cases has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. In fact, Gould was so convinced that the fossil record did not show this slow intermediary type of evolution that he came up with a whole new idea called punctuated equilibrium. So instead of having gradual changes in a gradual tree, what he suggested was that, basically things stayed in stasis or stayed the same for a long time. And then all of a sudden you would have a major, maybe a change in just a few 100,000 years, or maybe even 1,000 years. And so you had this punctuated equilibrium. In other words, evolution occurred in sudden jumps followed by long periods of a little change. Now, the fossil record really does suggest that. And so at least At least Gould was trying to look at the evidence and try to figure out how to explain that. That's why he came up with this idea. Of course, this idea has a problem too. It's like, okay, so does an alligator, reptile lay an egg and out pops a bird? Well, it may wouldn't, Gould wasn't suggesting it would be quite that fast, but what he was suggesting is that evolution occurred in these really, really quick jumps. And so you had to have several changes occur all at once. And of course, the evidence today does not show that. We don't find we don't find lots of changes in the fossil record or in critters today. If you have a major change of 3 or 4 or 5 different mutations, usually that critter dies. There are other gaps that we also talk about in the fossil record. We're not going to I'm not going to go through all these. I just want to highlight them, and you could look these up on your own. Bioluminescence. There are critters that have this glowing thing about them, like fireflies and deep ocean critters that live like in the Marianas Trench and stuff. We have no idea how that evolved. We have critters without bioluminescence and we have critters with bioluminescence, but we don't know how that happened. We have like electric eels that produce this electricity, and they produce a lot of it. It can kill you. Okay. But the deal is, we don't have any idea how that happened. We have critters without it and critters with it, and we don't know how that evolved at all. We have chemical warfare in insects. We have, insects that can use chemicals to kill other insects. We have, different types of beetles that produce like chemicals that harm other critters and can kill them. We have centipedes. They actually make cyanide. And, how would a living organism develop cyanide to kill others, but it doesn't kill itself? And so on. So all of these things are possible places where the evolutionists really need to come up with ideas and legitimate reasons or ideas on how this happened or developed. We've already mentioned the communications on bees and how that looks like it was designed in nature. We don't have a gap, or we have a big gap between insects that can't do this and insects that can. And of course, we have whales and we have dolphins that also use echo communication, and bats. We have critters that don't do that. We have critters that do that, but we don't have any critters, as far as we know, that have these in between types of things. So what's our conclusion? Well, missing transitional forms actually supports the creation model, not the naturalistic model. It looks like many of these animals were designed, and there's no evidence that they could occur in small steps, like the evolutionary model suggests.